this is the opening of the Manchester Railway, 1830. Doesn't look anything like a train, of course, I know, except for the fact that you've got wheels and something on the wheels. But this was, of course, a very rudimentary form of the railways. And you recall that in my discussion of the railways, I mentioned to you that particularly in countries such as India, the effect of the railways exceeded anything that it did in places like Britain. Of course, in Britain as well as in Germany, it transformed the physical landscape. But if you recall that vis-a-vis India, for example, I pointed to two, and I could point to many other, but two implications, such as the fact that, for example, the pilgrimage routes got changed, and of course it led to the mixture of the castes, different castes, something which really became a considerable issue. Because there were a great many people who didn't, in fact, actually want to use the railways precisely for that reason. But on the other hand, the advantages of using it clearly outweigh the disadvantages, such as the fact that you could get from destination from point A to point B in a much shorter span of time, so forth and so on, right? But anyhow, so when we're speaking about the Industrial Revolution, we're speaking about, remember that we're moving from a trade-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy, and then we can look at particular aspects of that, such as the railways, transformation in the iron industry, the invention of the steamship. The first transatlantic steamship started operating in 1838. What it did was it cut down the passage time considerably. So, you know, when you have Indian indentured immigrants, about whom I'm going to speak much later on, just to take one group of people, going from India to a place like Trinidad or Guyana in the Caribbean, that journey of 2.5, 3 months would be eventually cut down to a month. And of course, gradually over a period of time, moving into the 19th century, that passage would continue to be cut down in time. I just want to look very briefly, you know, I'd spoken to you about the second agricultural revolution, as it's often termed. You might recall that there were some implications of this, and I suggested to you that you might want to look at it as a subset of the Industrial Revolution. But I want to point to one or two other aspects which I hadn't touched upon in my previous lecture, because I hadn't finished with that subject. And one of those is what I want to use a broader term, and I want to describe to you some of the complications of this term, which is the notion of what is called the commons. The commons. So one of the things that you had in Scotland, in the Highlands, you know. So if you know the topography of Scotland, you know that you have the major cities, or cities such as Edinburgh and Glasgow, but then you have further north, you have what are called the Highlands, which are very sparsely populated. And in the Highlands, what you really had was you had private ownership of lands, you know, very often relatively smaller tracts. And when the English colonized the Scots, and you should keep in mind that England colonized not just the external others, such as Indians and Africans, they colonized the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, and of course their women, right? I mean, these are all forms of colonization. So what you have in a place like the Highlands is what are called the Highland clearances. The Highland clearances. In other words, what they did was they basically tried to eviscerate, wipe out many of these small landlords, and try to consolidate the land holdings. Consolidate the land holdings, and very often then what you do is you fence them, right? So what they're building are these enclosures. And I'm suggesting to you that this is one of the characteristic features of this kind of industrial of this second agricultural revolution. It's not simply the kinds of things I described to you before. For example, the manner in which you put the seed in the ground. So, you know, Jethro Tull, remember that of course you have mechanized farming coming in various ways, but there are other implications because land relations are going to change very considerably as a consequence of the second agricultural revolution. Now, going to this term commons, I want to point to a contradiction or paradox at the source. All right, two contradictory trends that we need to think about, which, in a manner of speaking, come about as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. One is the decline of the commons. The decline of the commons, because what's happening here is the notion that you fence off larger tracts of land, you put them in private hands, right? And of course, in order to make mechanized farming more efficient, you need larger units of land. If you have large tractors, for which at this point you don't, but when mechanized farming is going to come in a really big way, right? Obviously, it's much more successful if the tracts of land are much larger. And of course, in the 20th century, you're going to see that in places such as the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution. So, you know, there is a forcible collectivization of agriculture, as it's called. Now, I'm saying that some of its predecessors are to be found beginning in the late 18th century. So, what is the relationship of that to the commons? The commons is the notion that, for example, there are pasture lands which do not have to be defined as private property. The pasture lands belong to the village. That anyone who lives in that village can send their animals to graze on that land. But what's going to happen as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, which is also giving rise to the notion of private property, that notion was there before. John Locke, for example, had already written a treatise, right, many decades ago. And of course, Locke is critical in many ways as, if I may put it this way, one of the founding fathers of the American Revolution. You know, one of the tacit founding fathers of the American Revolution. But what's happening here is not simply that conception of private property, but a much more aggravated conception of it. Okay, so in other words, it leads to the notion of private property in this sense also leads to the decline of the commons. And in some ways, that is a very useful concept to understand certain features of our society at the present moment. The fact that water, which you would think is part of the commons, that is that all living beings should have access to water, and why should we have to pay for it? Right, of course you have to pay for it if it's coming through, you know, LADWP into your home, because otherwise, you know, you could have unchecked. But the fact that, for example, bottled water, which now everyone carries. I mean, when I was going to university back in 1978, when I first started, I don't remember anybody carrying a bottle of water the way in which everybody carries a bottle of water now. You know, it's become privatized. And in many countries in South America, in fact, it's a big business. What has happened? That water has moved out of the commons. In some ways, you could say that even air has moved out of the commons. So of course you breathe much cleaner air in certain countries than you do in others. Why? It's not simply because pollution there is unchecked, so forth and so on. It has to do with the fact that now the notion that you are entitled to clean air has been taken out of the commons. Right? Yes?
That reminds me of when I traveled to Brazil. It's different from here, where in the U.S., if you go to a restaurant, they serve you water and stuff like that. In Brazil, they don't. Like, you charge water, you're not offered water. And it's just interesting how that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one could do a whole course around the political economy of water and try to track it over a period of centuries. Okay, but so this is one element of it. However, I was pointing to the fact that there is, in fact, a contradictory movement with respect to the notion of the commons. Because at the same time as the commons is declining, beginning in the late 18th century, moving to the 19th century, another conception of the commons is coming to the fore. What do I mean by that? When does the middle class arise? In Western countries. It is fundamentally in the 19th century. And it is, in fact, a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, because what the Industrial Revolution is going to do, I mean, go back to the French Revolution. Remember the three estates, the nobility, the clergy. I mean, they're minuscule. You don't really have a conception of the middle class in France in 1760, 1770, 1780. Now, what the Industrial Revolution is going to do when manufacturing is going to increase, right? It's going to eventually pave the way for the creation of the middle class. One of the things that the middle class is going to be able to do in the 19th century, and I think the history of the middle class in the 19th century is very different than what the middle class does today. But in the 19th century, if you look at the United States, what is it that the middle class was able to achieve? It was able to achieve the creation of certain goods, social goods, that it was argued were part of the commons. What would those social goods be? Street lighting, a public library system, a public education system. Right? There is a certain realization that these are certain social goods that we all have a right to in a certain sense. And this is made possible by in the 19th century by the rise of a substantial middle class, and of course then a system of taxation which goes along with that, because what's going to happen, of course, is the tax base is going to increase considerably. The number of people who would have paid tax, right? And we're not going to here look at the whole history of income tax and, you know, when did it start in different countries, so forth and so on. But the number of people who would have had to pay tax would have been very small at a certain point, and then in the 19th century that tax base is going to increase, and of course now if you're looking at the United States, you're saying that the vast majority of people are going to be paying individual income tax. You know, in many countries in the global south, the tax base is still very small. Even in countries such as India, less than 3% of the population of India pays individual income tax. Of course, there's considerable tax evasion, but even if you account for that, you would say that at the most it's going to be 5 to 7%. You know, if everyone who should really be paying tax is held accountable. Right? And that, of course, suggests that the middle class has not, at this point, become such a potent force in India as it was already becoming in the United States, so forth and so on. And what I'm saying is that there is a different notion of the commons, that as one notion of the commons is declining and is under attack, as illustrated by the Highland clearances, right, and by what are called the Enclosure Acts, which you find all over England. Right? On the other hand, a different conception of the commons is coming to the fore. All right? Now, one last thing, before we just quickly go to trying to summarize. Let me also show you a couple more slides here. So this image is unidentified, but this is an English factory, a sweeper and a doffer, and this is the children of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you can tell partly from the photographs what the working conditions are like for many of these children. And then over here, what you have what are called breaker boys. This is actually from much later on. And this is, in fact, from the United States. This is a photograph by Louis Hine, a very famous photographer. And this is circa 1910, because, of course, the Industrial Revolution came to the United States later than it had in Britain and in Germany, right? And this is a sketch by Gustave Doré, a very famous artist of the second half of the 19th century. What you're seeing here is London, circa 1870. It shows the density of the population and the environmental degradation. And in fact, I recall that in my concluding remarks to you on Wednesday, I pointed to the fact that one of the things that was happening in England was the physical transformation of the landscape. Now you had soot all over, you know, all right? You had, you know, these industries that were belching smoke. And of course, at this point, this was virtually all unregulated, right? And this is the Crystal Palace, the interior of that designed by Joseph Paxton for what was called the Great Exhibition. So by the mid-19th century, they would have these industrial fairs where each country would be invited to send a team of delegates and essentially exhibit the kind of manufacturing, you know, goods that were being produced in that particular country. All right. One of the things that we're going to be looking at in some detail And I'm going to just start you off right now today, and then we're going to continue with this theme, and that is the theme of textiles, very briefly, with which I'm going to really conclude my illustrations of the Industrial Revolution. And it will also be a segue, of course, into the whole question of colonialism and India under colonial rule. In the early part of the 1700s, the textile capital of the world, without a shadow of a doubt, was India. Right? India was the largest manufacturer and producer of cotton textiles. Indian cottons were extremely comfortable, easy to wash and maintain, very durable, versatile, and in fact, Indian cottons began to replace woolens in the British market. Britain, I want to remind you, and this is not intended as a joke, but I want you to think about it, Britain had virtually nothing to export to a country like India. The only thing it could really export was woolens, and if you know anything about the climate of India, you know that there's not much use for woolens in most part of India. So when we are going to look at very briefly the trade between India and England, we're going to find that England, in fact, when it was importing cotton textiles and eventually spices and a number of other things from India, what was it sending in return? Bullion. And when I say bullion, I mean silver and gold. Right? That's all it could send. And that was, of course, exactly what was happening vis-a-vis China as well. Right? So when we begin to look at textiles, but you'll see the relationship to the Industrial Revolution in just a moment. So what we're saying is that the British market, beginning in the 1700s, is going to early 1700s, mid 1700s, is going to begin to be flooded by textiles, Indian cotton textiles. And so, of course, one of the British things that the British did was they would place tariffs, impose tariffs to make it more expensive. Right? The idea was to discourage. And there's a large literature on whether the imposition of these tariffs actually discouraged the British from buying these cotton textiles, which were heavily in demand. And generally, by the way, many of these cotton textiles were then imported from Britain. Once they'd been imported from India into Britain, then from Britain they were imported to the rest of Europe. What's going to happen when India falls under colonial rule? And Marx, in fact, describes this vividly in Capital Volume 1 and in a number of other places, is that from being the largest manufacturer and producer of textiles, India, and the largest exporter in the world, India is going to become the largest importer of textiles in the world eventually, right? How did that happen? Well, it happened, of course, because that once India falls under colonial rule, and then you have the Industrial Revolution, you're going to have, I mean, to put it in just one phrase, you're going to have mill manufactured clothing replacing hand manufactured clothing, right? That's essentially one of the things that's going to take place. Now, in Britain itself, because you had a woolen industry, so there was some experience with textiles over there as well. There was a system whereby some of the work was actually done in a manufacturing plant, and some of this was actually sent out to private homes, because this was one way. So you would actually, what is called the putting out system. So what happens there? Raw cotton is actually going to be left at workers' home, where the women and the children would very often spin it into yarn. The men then wove it into cloth, which was then purchased by merchants. However, as the Industrial Revolution moves along, right, this system is going to be eliminated. Everything is going to be moved back into one central manufacturing unit, rather than parceling it out into all of these homes, right? So what does the invention of the spinning jenny, for example, which I had shown you a slide of that in my previous lecture, right? And the fact that these machines continue to improve. So here is a tangible consequence, right? If I give you the data, 100 pounds of cotton yarn could be produced by spinners working for 50,000 hours. Just think of it, 100 pounds of cotton yarn produced by spinners working for 50,000 hours. With the new machinery, in England, this could be achieved in 2,000 hours instead of 50,000 hours. By 1835, this had been reduced to 135 hours. So what used to take 50,000 hours is now going to take 135 hours. There's much more consistency now in the production of the cloth. Right? That's what happens, of course, when you have mill manufactured clothing. There's much more consistency, much more regularity. Right? And there were, of course, some kinds of improvements in strength, durability, and texture. By the 1820s, cotton textiles were Britain's largest export. By 1820, now, of course, India has been under British rule for over 60, 70 years. We're going to, of course, go back to the whole subject of India under colonial rule. And this accounted for nearly half of all of Britain's exports. And as I pointed out to you, India, which had been the world's largest producer and exporter of textiles, will now become the world's largest importers. All right. So, but and we could continue this narrative of textiles, but just keep this in mind. All right. Now let me try to sum up, because we do have to move on to other segments. Let me try to sum up some of the major consequences of the Industrial Revolution, some of its major manifestations, things that you need to think about. So, and I'm really reiterating at this juncture what I've already mentioned before, but by way of a conclusion, I think this would really be useful. So there is a shift from, as I said, a trade-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy. The nature of work changes. Yeah, how does it change? Partially because you have a specialization of labor, And I think this is exceedingly important. You have to consider this alongside what I call the alienation of labor. This is, of course, Marx is going to talk about this at considerable length. Why is this important? For lots of reasons. But let's take one argument here. Typically, in an economy where manufacturing, according to the new norms, where you have the specialization of labor, typically before this advent, the person who is working with a product would usually see the product from the beginning to the end. And so what Marx is going to talk about is the alienation of labor. Now, the alienation of labor can be understood in many different registers. But the principal register we're looking at here, apropos of this example, is the fact that now the artisan, the worker, is no longer going to see, when there's a specialization of labor, is no longer going to see the product from the finish to the end. So if you're making this particular, table, right? So, and if you have a specialization of labor, so someone might be building its legs, someone might be building the tabletop, someone might be polishing it, right? And that's what you're doing. For 12 hours a day, you're just polishing it, or you're building the legs, or you're building the tabletop. And of course, some of these goods are much more complex. There might be 50 people doing 50 different things, but you're doing that same thing over and over again. And of course, one of the reasons why the capitalists adopted this is because they argue that this is a more efficient way of doing it. Because you only need to learn how to put on the screws on the legs, if that's what you're going to be doing. And you're going to be doing that for 10 hours a day, or 12 hours a day. But what Marx is saying is that this is partly what he means by the alienation of labor, that you are now alienated, that you have no emotional investment in what you're doing. So this is one of the consequences. It paves the way for capitalism. And I discussed with you very briefly before the relationship between the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. The two are not the same thing. Right? They're not the same thing but there is a relationship between the two. Because capitalism here is now is something that is going to become what you might call the motor of history. Okay? Another very interesting implication. The attitudes towards wealth change. I don't believe that most histories of the Industrial Revolution dwell on this very much. Why do they change? Because of course, you also have a decline of religion. So this is partially what I'm speaking about when I speak about processes of secularization, processes of secularization. When you have these processes of certain secularization where institutions become increasingly secularized, you have the separation of the public and the private spheres. Remember that religion is going to be consigned largely to the private sphere. Before all of this happens, there was a rather widespread notion, which of course was strongly encouraged by the Catholic Church as well. Right? I mean, you could say even by the Protestant churches, but certainly by the Catholic churches, that the accumulation of wealth was sinful in some sense. Right? Now, I think that this particular notion is going to largely collapse. It's going to largely collapse. And I'm suggesting to you that when you look at something like the Industrial Revolution, you cannot view it simply, as a transformation to manufacturing, what's happening in the factory. All these is exceedingly important. I would not have spent that much time on the Factory Acts, just as one illustration of how they attempted to regulate working conditions, if I didn't think it was important. But nonetheless, I'm saying to you that there are, in fact, exceedingly important considerations which take us to very different ways of thinking about the Industrial Revolution, right? And the collapse of the moral economy. Now, let me explain that. There is some relationship here as well. But let me explain that again by giving you one illustration. This is an argument made by an English social historian. I mean, there are others who have talked about it, but he was the one who really developed and who wrote an extraordinary book called The Making of the English Working Class, E.P. Thompson. And he describes what he calls the decline or collapse of the moral economy, by which he means something like this. That if you look at the history of England, now, there were a great many times when there were shortages of food that people experienced. And this led to what are called food riots. Right? However, his claim is that even in the worst of these times, when you had these food riots, there was still some notion of the moral economy, by which he means that there was some notion that I, living in this village, have some responsibility towards all the others living in this village. That I should not, so let's supposing that I'm someone who is a grain merchant. So should I hoard all the grain? Because you know what happens, right, when you have shortages of food, that if you start hoarding, then eventually you hope that you can sell, because there's a shortage, you can sell the grain that you have at sky-high prices. Right? Now he's saying, E.P. Thompson, that there was some check that the vast majority of people put on their own greed. But with the Industrial Revolution, these constraints are going to collapse. Now, I don't want to suggest that there weren't inequalities of wealth in the 18th century. I'm not going to make that argument. But I think that the notion that you would have, billionaires, that if you take 3 or 4 of the world's richest men today, and they have more wealth than 500 million people put together in Africa, as it were, this idea was unthinkable. It was unthinkable. And one of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution is going to be precisely this, that there's going to be a collapse of the moral economy. Question?
Okay, so I don't know how to ask this. Other than accumulation of, the attitude towards wealth change, how does the Industrial Revolution increase secularization? In what other ways?
How does it increase secularization in other ways?
Yeah.
Secularization means essentially a number of things. One of the things it means is that religion ceases to become important in many spheres of life. Right? So when we speak of secularization, we have to distinguish it, by the way, from secularism, because secularism is an ideology which stipulates that there should be a separation whether it separation, to use a classic phrase, between church and state, right? Whether in fact it actually takes place or not, and does so to the extent that nations claim that it takes place, is a different matter. We're not going to assess that now. For example, if somebody said, oh, the US is a secular state, well, I want to know, why is it that every president of the United States has to make a show of attending a prayer meeting or going to the Washington Cathedral or whatever the case might be? All right? Let me just finish 1 second, okay? All right? So secularization is a process. It's not an ideology. And when we speak about secularization, it's not just something that can be discussed apropos of institutions. It is something we can discuss apropos of individuals, that as an individual gets secularized, for example, that individual is much less likely to think of religion and the divine. So, okay, why did my crops fail? Now, in the 15th century, 16th century, you might say, well, that's God's will. Right? And just taking an example, when the process of secularization takes place, one tends to think less of religion as a determining factor. Okay? Yeah. Now, physical transformation of the landscape, something I've already, again, touched upon. I want to read out to you a poem. We will be looking at poems as well in this class. There's no reason why historians should not look at poetry or fiction. Okay? So this is a poem by William Blake. And William Blake was one of a handful of the great English Romantic poets. All right? This is London. The poem is called London, written by him in 1792. What was happening by the 1790s? You remember the slide I showed you here. This is a slide which 1870. But by 1790, London was already fundamentally transformed. Fundamentally transformed. Okay? And this is what he says. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, that's the river, of course, in London, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe, sorrow. Right? He's saying, you know, people's faces, they seem to be full of sorrow. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice and every ban is curse, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. We don't have the luxury of being able to analyze, you know, the poem, but giving you a sense of the kind of sense of despondency, the manner in which society has fundamentally changed. All right. So these are, I think, sort of the things that I would like you to think about. And on that concluding note, following from Blake, I'm saying that it sharpens the divide between the positivists and the romantics. What do we mean by the positivists and the romantics? The positivists are those who say, well, look, what's happened is for the good. Right? We've got manufacturing, and of course, as you move into the 19th century, the invention of the railways, the steamship, you know, time and space, as an article in the New York Herald Tribune in the 1840s said. The phrase they used was, they said, time and space have been annihilated. Annihilated. Of course, this was even before the airplane, right? But the fact that you could go quickly from one destination to another, that's partially that the notion of space itself was now going to be changed. But the positivists, I'm saying to you, they took this view and they said that, look, on the whole, everything that's happened is for the good. The romantics are looking not simply at the ugliness that has crept into the English countryside. You know? And of course, you could say they were working with a very idealized conception of the English countryside. You know, if you ever go to the Cotswolds in England, I mean, it's almost amusing, because it's, you know, their notion of a mountain is something that's about 400 feet, and that's a mountain. Okay? and you know, a bridge that is, you know, a bridge that is this wide. That's it, over a little stream and ducks flowing, you know, not flowing, ducks moving very gently. It looks very cute. Picture postcard. A very romantic landscape, small scale. In the Industrial Revolution is going to change the scale of things. It's going to mar the landscape. But it's not, the Romantics are not simply bemoaning the loss of that landscape. That's what I want to urge upon you. Don't think that they're simply working with this idealized conception of the English country. They're saying man's soul has now been altered. And of course, then you have to go to such things as the moral economy, so forth and so on, the set of values that we cherish, with which we work. All of this is being changed. So this divide between the positivists and, as I'm calling them, and the Romantics is going to begin to sharpen. All right. Now, the next segment, and essentially today's lecture on India under British rule, the section we have on colonialism and the nation state and revolutions in Latin America. They all three of them can be understood together. Right? And I want to begin by asking you to look very carefully at these 5 slides. So this is the world in 1660. This is all with respect to colonization, right? So here you have Europe, here, of course, and this is France and Great Britain, and this large, very large landscape is, of course, Russia. Now you look at India. What do you see here? You see a few colored spots on the coasts, and I'll show you a slide much later on. These are European settlements in India by 1660. Now, we're not looking at the 17th century in detail. We're really big. This whole course begins circa 1750, right? Roughly around there. But just so that you get a sense of how the world looks very different at one point from another point with respect to the question of colonies, European colonies. Where did Europe have its colonies? And of course, Australia, it shows nothing here, right? Because there was no European presence in Australia in 1660. Right? So this is, and you can see again in Africa, you can see a little bit over here, where you see the greatest degree of European colonization. These are all Spanish colonies, because of course the conquest of the Americas took place much earlier, largely by Spain and Portugal, and you see a little Portuguese presence over here, particularly along the coast in the eastern part of Latin America. Now let's take a look at 1754, right? So you see that the colonization of Latin America again has become much more substantial. Now you've got a much larger portion. Much of this, of course, is present-day Brazil. This is all under Portuguese rule, and then you have, so now in 1660 you didn't really see much of this, but now you're beginning to see over here. So this is French colonies in North America, and so including the American colonies and what is present-day Canada, and of course you see the English presence over here as well on the eastern seaboard in particular, right? And you see in India now, you notice that the coastal presence has become much sharper, right? So basically eastern and western coast, and you know what this is, right? You know what this country is over here? Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, also called Serendip, right? The word serendipity comes from Serendip, which is the old name for Sri Lanka. Now look at 1822, right? 1822. So of course, by this point in time, and this color over here, the orange color, this is all English colonies. You notice that before it was much more multicolored. Now it's not, because the other European powers have largely been eviscerated from India, right? So it's what you're really talking about now is a small, Portuguese colony here called Goa, but essentially it's basically English presence. Australia has started to become colonized. Australia was a convict colony by and large. Okay, I mean the vast majority of Englishmen who went to Australia were sent there as convicts, and you know that shouldn't leave you with an impression that that's the genetic stock of everybody in Australia, because I can also tell you that in England in the year 1800, if you stole 2 chickens, the minimum punishment was amputation of your hands. Okay, and sometimes you could get sent to the gallows for stealing a horse. Right? So the number of crimes for which you could be given capital punishment was extraordinary. You know, I suspect that if they used those criteria, 99% of the population would be convicts. You know, all right. So this is Australia, and you can see India over here, and you can see Africa, but you can see again largely it's the coastal regions that we're talking about, where you have a European presence. Moving into the interior was much more difficult. This is true even of Australia, where down to the present day, the vast majority of the population lives roughly about 50, no more than 50 to 75 miles from the coastline, wherever you are. So, you know, the New South Wales moving down into Melbourne, and then Adelaide over here, and this, of course, here being Darwin, the Northern Territory, right? And now, if you look at the world in 1885, this is a very, you know, how one draws maps is an extraordinarily interesting question, and the politics of cartography. Okay, politics of cartography. Australia in 1885, right, is, you notice the interior is shown in gray, which means that there's no European presence there. Now, strictly speaking, that's not really true. Why is it not really true? Because all of Australia had come under English rule. And of course, they wouldn't call it rule anymore because Australia was a white colony, so it had dominion status. Unlike the non-white colonies, and the same thing of Canada. You notice here, was Canada a colony of Britain in 1885? No. But it's shown as a British possession because it was a dominion. It was not a republic, you know, right? But what is tricky here is that this portion that is shown here as, if I may put it this way, not having any European presence, there are 2 implications, both of which we must reject, or at least question. One is the notion that there was nobody there. And of course, this was not true of even this. There was always an indigenous population. There was an Aboriginal population. And of course, what did they do to the Aboriginal population? They killed the Aboriginal population largely. The other thing is that this area is very hard to negotiate. It's largely desert. It's largely desert. So the Europeans really weren't interested in going there because they said, well, there's really nothing there anyhow. You know. Right? But what I'm saying is that this points to the fact, because really it should all be in orange, but they haven't shown it that way. Right? Now, the last of these maps, and notice this is 1885. Now we're talking about 1898, only 13 years later. And just look, right? You know, it's multicolored. Some will say it's multicultural. No, this is not how we want our multiculturalism here, right? What is happening here? All of Africa has been taken over. And you know, those Europeans who couldn't get into the game before, because a good example being Germany, because Germany was not unified, there was a confederation. Another good example being Italy, because Italian unification took place much later in the 19th century. Italy was in no position to compete with France, you know, and of course Great Britain. And there are countries such as, you know what this is here? Anybody?
Germany.
Sorry?
Belgium.
Belgium, yeah. And what would it be? What country at that point?
It's the Congo.
The Congo. Belgian Congo, right? So, you know, Belgium, which is a minuscule dot on the map, frankly, I mean, you can go from one end of the country to another in 2 hours, more or less, right? And now they've got this humongous place over here, and the havoc that they wreak here, we're going to look at later on, is just extraordinary. All right? So this is Belgian Congo. We're not going to look at each and every country, but just giving you an illustration. And then, of course, here again, the key being that in the orange, you have these are all British colonies. Now, by the way, you know, all of Australia is shown as being orange. All right, and partially what's going to happen, of course, is the union, you know, is going to be affected. Okay, which is going to happen in South Africa, or very early 1900s as well, because South Africa was not one country in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. You know, you had different provinces, and you had Dutch influence, you had English influence, but it was not one country at that point in time. Right? But basically, what we are saying is, and of course, all of India here, all of India now is under British rule. Right? So this, keep in mind, this is one of the principal motifs, is the whole phenomenon of colonialism. Let's move to India. That will be a primary example. It's a primary example for a number of reasons. One, I know it best. Okay, I know it better than I know the history of Indonesia. I know something about Indonesia under Dutch rule, and Indochina, or you know, what is present-day Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos under French rule. But that's not the only reason, of course, to look at India as our main illustration of the whole process of colonization. India was by far the biggest and richest colony that any European power had. And we're going to find out that the British in India were able to effect a transformation that was in many ways extraordinary, but that was also, as when we turn to nationalism, that in India the course of nationalism took a very different turn. Right? So this is one reason why I think the illustration of India is not unimportant. All right. Now, the European settlements. So if you look at this slide over here, all we're really saying here is that, you know, 1498-7. This is before the period that we're looking at. That you can see that the European settlements here. The Europeans have come to trade in India. This is the British have come as traders. There's something called the East India Company, which gets established on 31st December 1600. Elizabeth is the queen. She gives a charter to a group of merchants who say, we want to establish a company to trade with India. One of the reasons to trade with India was so that you could eliminate all the middlemen. And after, of course, the navigations of the late 1400s and the 1500s, when a route was found through the Cape of Good Hope, right? Essentially, if I had to cut that long story short, one of the things that the European powers hoped to do at that point in time, Britain is not really a power at that point. Okay, in 1600, it's going to emerge. But what the European countries were hoping to do was to be able to get such things as spices from places like Indonesia, where the Dutch were going to establish a trading company as well. It's called the Dutch East India Trading Company. All right, the French would establish a trading company. So what they were hoping to do was that they were hoping to marginalize the Muslim middlemen, because otherwise the trade routes would have gone through Aden, and all that area is controlled by the Ottomans, all right, through the whole Red Sea area. So they are basically looking for trading routes, and of course India was a land of fabled wealth. I mean, if you read Hegel and Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history written in the 1830s, he talks about this, you know. And he's writing in the 1830s, but he's talking about what kind of impression Europeans had of India at that point in time. So largely coastal settlements, and we're going to find that, of course, as you saw in the preceding slides, that the Danish, the French, the Dutch, you know, all of these are going to get largely eliminated. With a history that we are not going to consider because we're really looking at India under British rule. Right? I don't expect you to know all of these details. You don't even worry about them. And I'm not going to go over all of them. But somewhere around early 1700s, what you have is the death of the Mughal emperor. The Mughal Empire was the empire that existed in India before the advent of the British, and the last of the really great Mughal emperors, a man by the name of Aurangzeb, dies in 1700. Okay, the British by now have a considerable trading presence. One of the arguments that's going to be used, the last point I'm going to make, and then I'll stop for today. The question that emerges, and we're going to begin the narrative from there, and we're going to spend very little time on it so that we can move to the manner in which the British, okay, effected certain changes. The question that emerges is, when the Mughal Empire goes into decline, is that what makes it possible for the English, who came as traders, to eventually become the dominant presence? You know, you've heard that phrase, and I'm not saying this is the argument I want to make, but I'm just laying it before you. You've heard that phrase, nature abhors a vacuum. So that the Mughal Empire, which had centralized its rule in India, it collapses. The British are already there as traders. Are they going to take advantage of that situation? Because the question is, how did they, from being traders, become colonizers? Right? That's the question. So we'll stop there, and I'll pick up this narrative on Monday.